The silence was a weapon, and for 3 days everyone in courtroom 4B thought it was being used against her. They saw Eleanor Vance, a ghost in beige, and assumed her silence was the sound of defeat. Her husband, a titan of industry, sat with his lawyer radiating power. His mistress, polished and perfect, was ready to deliver the final blow. They mistook Eleanor's stillness for weakness, her quiet gaze for surrender. They were about to learn that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who roar. They are the ones who sit and watch and wait for the perfect moment to unleash a storm you never saw coming. The courtroom was Richard Vance's cathedral, and he was its reigning god. Every surface from the polished mahogany of the judge's bench to the scuffed linoleum tiles seemed to reflect his success. He was a man built of sharp angles and expensive tailoring, his silvering hair catching the sterile fluorescent light just so. Beside him, his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, was a bulldog in a bespoke suit, all jowls and confident aggression. They were a formidable pair, the architect of a real estate empire and the legal demolitions expert hired to protect it. On the other side of the aisle sat Eleanor. To the casual observer, she was a study in faded elegance. Her beige linen suit, once a symbol of quiet sophistication, now seemed to hang on her a size too big for the woman she had become. For 3 days, she had remained a statue of composure. She listened without flinching as Thorne painted a portrait of her as a pampered, clueless housewife who had contributed nothing to Richard's colossal success with Vance Sterling properties beyond hosting the occasional dinner party. Mrs. Vance Thorne had boomed on the first day his voice, echoing in the cavernous room, enjoyed the fruits of Mr. Vance's labor. A beautiful home, luxurious vacations, a limitless credit card for her. Hobbies. The word hobbies was laced with a particular venom, reducing her life's work, curating art for private collectors. A skill that had once filled their home with beauty and conversation to little more than a girlish pastime. Eleanor didn't react. Her hands remained loosely clasped in her lap. Her expression was placid, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the judge's shoulder. Inside, however, a slow, cold fire was burning. She remembered the nights she'd spent poring over architectural blueprints with Richard, her fine arts background giving her a unique perspective on line and form. She remembered the small inheritance from her grandmother, the $50,000 that served as the seed money for their first risky property, flip a detail conveniently absent from Richard's triumphant narrative of being a self-made man. She remembered sketching the original swan-like logo for Vance Sterling on a cocktail napkin during a hopeful wine-fueled dinner 20 years ago. Her own lawyer, a court-appointed man named Mr. Davies, was competent but utterly outmatched. He was a dinghy facing a battleship. He shuffled his papers, raised meek objections that Thorne swatted away like flies, and offered Eleanor sympathetic, helpless glances. He had advised her to settle. "Eleanor, they're offering you the house and a 5-year alimony package. It's more than most get. If this goes to trial, Thorne will eviscerate you. He'll paint you as a gold digger." "I am not a gold digger, Mr. Davies," she had replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I was a partner. I was the co-founder. I will not be erased." He hadn't understood. No one did. They saw the shell, not the steel beneath. The discovery of the affair hadn't been a text message or a lipstick-stained collar. It had been far more insidious, far more insulting. She had been looking for a property survey in Richard's home office when she found a separate set of architectural plans rolled tightly in a cardboard tube. They weren't for a client. They were for a private residence, a breathtakingly modern glass house cantilevered over a cliff in Big Sur. The project name was the Serenity Project. And on the client detail line, it read R. Vance and C. Sterling, Chloe Sterling, the impossibly young, raven-haired VP of acquisitions at his company, the woman Richard had called his protégé. Suddenly, all the late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls, the sudden business trips to California, clicked into a sickeningly clear picture. They weren't just having an affair. They were building a future on a foundation of assets Eleanor had helped create. That was the moment the quiet, accommodating Eleanor began to recede, and a new, colder, more calculating version of herself began to form. She didn't scream or throw things. She didn't confront him. She calmly rolled the plans back up, placed them exactly where she found them, and went downstairs to make coffee. She sat at the kitchen island, the heart of the home she had built, and she began to think. Not as a wife, but as a strategist. She knew this day in court was coming, and she knew Richard's ego would be his undoing. He wouldn't just divorce her. He would try to humiliate her, to obliterate her contributions, to leave her with nothing but crumbs from the feast she had helped cook. And that was exactly what she was counting on. So she sat day after day, absorbing the blows. She listened to financial experts testify that her name was on none of the primary corporate accounts. She heard former colleagues of Richard's men she'd had in her home for Christmas speak of his singular vision and drive. Each lie, each calculated omission was a stone. They thought they were burying her with them. They had no idea she was using them to build a foundation of her own. Richard Vance took the stand on the second day, a masterclass in performative charm and subtle arrogance. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that made him look less like a defendant and more like a keynote speaker at a wealth management conference. He smiled warmly at the judge, nodded respectfully at the jury, and completely ignored the woman he had spent 2 decades married to. Marcus Thorne led him through his testimony like a seasoned conductor. The questions were softballs designed to inflate Richard's ego and solidify his narrative. Mr. Vance, could you tell the court how Vance Sterling Properties began? Richard leaned into the microphone, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. It began with a dream. Marcus, I was a young, hungry broker with a vision for creating not just buildings, but lifestyles. I saved every penny I earned, worked 100-hour weeks. I risked everything I had on my first project. There was no mention of Eleanor's $50,000. It was a detail scrubbed from history. And your wife, Eleanor, what was her role in these early, difficult years? Richard sighed, a theatrical display of weary magnanimity. Eleanor. She was my support system. She made our house a home. I wanted her to be comfortable, to be free from the stress of the business world, so she could pursue her passions. Art gardening, charity luncheons. I was proud to provide that life for her. The narrative was clear. He was the creator, the provider. She was the beneficiary, the kept woman. He spoke of multi-million-dollar deals, closed on golf courses of sleepless nights, spent wrestling with zoning laws of the sheer force of his will that had bent the city's skyline to his ambition. He was Icarus, telling the story of how he built his own sun. Eleanor watched her face, a perfect mask of neutrality. She remembered the truth behind the polished lies. The deal closed on the golf course had been salvaged by her when she charmed the investor's wife at a gallery opening, bonding over a shared love for the sculptor Alberto Giacometti. The investor had later told Richard, "Your wife is a class act." She sealed the deal. Richard had simply smiled and accepted the compliment as his own. The sleepless nights were real, but he wasn't alone. She had been beside him brewing coffee at 3 a.m., acting as a sounding board for his frustrations, and often providing the simple, elegant solution his overworked mind had missed. "What if you don't fight the Historical Society on the facade, Richard?" She'd once suggested, looking over a contested blueprint. "What if you embrace it? Make it the centerpiece. It's not a liability. It's the property's soul." That project. The Beaumont Hotel became one of his most celebrated winning awards for historical preservation, awards he accepted alone. Thorne pressed on his questions, becoming more pointed. "So, to be clear, Mr. Vance did. Mrs. Vance ever have any official capacity at Vance Sterling Properties? Was she ever on the payroll, a board member, an officer of the corporation?" "No, never," Richard said with finality. "I wanted to protect her from all that. It was my burden to carry. The burden that had bought him a Porsche, a private jet, and a different woman to share his future with." Mr. Davies's cross-examination was painfully inept. He tried to poke holes in Richard's story, but he lacked the information, the killer instinct. "Mr. Vance, isn't it true that your wife often accompanied you to business dinners?" "Of course," Richard smiled. "She was a wonderful hostess, a great asset in a social setting. He'd reduced her to an accessory. And isn't it true her inheritance provided the initial capital for your first joint venture?" Richard's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the mask of charm slipped back on. "Eleanor was very generous with a gift she gave me early in our marriage. I, of course, paid her back tenfold through the lifestyle I provided. It was a gift, not an investment. A gift." He had recategorized her foundational contribution as a quaint little present, like a hand-knitted sweater. With every answer, the hole they were digging for Eleanor grew deeper. The jury, a collection of ordinary people, saw a billionaire and his stay-at-home wife. It was a story as old as time, and it usually ended one way. Richard Vance and Marcus Thorne were sure of their victory. They controlled the narrative, the evidence, the very air in the room. They saw Eleanor's silence not as patience, but as proof of her powerlessness. As Richard stepped down from the stand, he allowed himself a fleeting glance at Eleanor. It was a look of pity and dismissal. He had already moved on. She was just a piece of old business to be tidied up. He turned his attention to the front row, where Chloe Sterling sat offering him a small, triumphant smile. She was next. She was the final nail in Eleanor's coffin. Chloe Sterling moved through the courtroom like a panther. She was all sleek lines, dressed in a form-fitting graphite dress that was both professional and predatory. Her black hair was a sharp, glossy bob, and her crimson lipstick was a slash of defiance. She was the future, and she was there to bury the past. She took the stand, swore the oath with a steady, manicured hand, and looked directly at Marcus Thorne. She never once glanced at Eleanor. To her, Eleanor was irrelevant, a relic. Thorne's questioning began gently establishing her credentials. "Ms. Sterling, you are the Vice President of Acquisitions at Vance Sterling Properties." "I am," she said, her voice crisp and confident. "And in your 5 years with the company, you've overseen its most profitable expansion phase, correct?" "That's correct. We've moved into international markets, securing over $2 billion in new development projects." She was impressive, and she knew it. The jury was paying attention. This was a woman of substance, a peer to the great Richard Vance. Then Thorne turned to the heart of the matter. "Ms. Sterling, you worked closely with Mr. Vance. Can you describe his creative process? His vision. Chloe leaned forward, her expression turning reverent. Richard is a visionary, but a vision needs a muse, a collaborator. He thinks in broad, brilliant strokes, and I help him connect the dots. We have a synergy. We'd work late into the night, just the two of us, brainstorming, challenging each other. The Serenity Project in Big Sur, for instance, that was born out of a conversation we had over dinner. It was our shared dream. She was not just claiming to be his business partner. She was claiming the role of his soulmate, his intellectual equal, the role that had once been Eleanor's. Then Thorne delivered the killing blow. He gestured vaguely toward Eleanor. In all those late-night sessions, in all those critical business meetings, did you ever see Mrs. Vance present? Did she ever contribute a single idea to the projects that have made Vance Sterling a global powerhouse? Chloe gave a small, almost pitying laugh. Eleanor. Of course not. She was of a different world. Richard always spoke of her fondly, but as someone to be sheltered from the business. Her expertise was in, I believe, tablecloths and flower arrangements for his parties. She was from another era. The courtroom was silent. It was a brutal public execution of a 20-year partnership. Chloe had not only confirmed the affair, but she had framed it as the inevitable result of a man outgrowing his provincial wife. She was the co-pilot. Eleanor was mere baggage. Eleanor sat her posture unchanged, her hands still resting in her lap. But inside the slow burn had become a furnace. Tablecloths and flower arrangements. She thought of the logo, the seed money, the architectural suggestions the clients won over by her knowledge and grace. All of it erased in a single, condescending sentence. Chloe wasn't finished. She looked at the jury, her eyes earnest and wide. I know my relationship with Richard is under scrutiny here, but what we have, it goes beyond the personal. It's a creative and intellectual partnership. I pushed him. I challenged him. I helped him build the second half of his empire. I am not the reason his marriage failed. His marriage failed because he was on a rocket ship, and his wife refused to even look at the sky. It was a brilliant, cruel, and devastating performance. She had painted herself as the heroine of Richard's story, the woman who had finally unleashed his true potential. Mr. Davies rose for his cross-examination, looking defeated before he even began. He asked a few perfunctory questions about company policy and timelines, which Chloe deflected with ease. He was a man with a water pistol fighting a flamethrower. When he sat down, the air in the room was thick with finality. It was over. Thorne had successfully framed the narrative. Richard was the genius, Chloe was the muse, and Eleanor was the obsolete first wife, entitled to a severance package, but nothing more. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, looked down at the petitioner's table. Mr. Davies, do you have any further witnesses? Mr. Davies sighed and shuffled his papers. No, Your Honor. Judge Miller then turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Vance, do you have anything you wish to say? This was it. The moment. The quiet stillness that had defined her for 3 days finally broke. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time, she looked directly at the judge, her eyes clear and impossibly calm. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a new and startling weight that made everyone in the room, including Richard and Chloe, sit up straight. There has been a change. Judge Miller raised an eyebrow. A change in what Mrs. Vance, Eleanor's gaze, swept past her stunned husband, past his smug mistress, and landed on the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. A change in counsel. Eleanor announced her voice as clear as a bell. As if on cue, the courtroom doors swung open. The man who entered courtroom 4B was not what anyone expected. He was tall and lean, likely in his late 70s, with a shock of perfectly white hair that fell across his forehead. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored grey suit that was at least a decade out of fashion, yet looked more elegant than anything Marcus Thorne owned. He carried a worn leather briefcase and moved with an unhurried, almost scholarly grace. He didn't look like a shark. He looked like a retired professor of classics. But Richard Vance knew better. The color drained from Richard's face. His mouth fell slightly agape, the confident smirk he'd worn for 3 days melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Marcus Thorne looked on, confused. He nudged his client. "Richard." "Who is that?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared his multi-billion-dollar empire, suddenly feeling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The old man walked down the aisle, his footsteps making a soft, steady rhythm on the floor. He nodded respectfully to the judge, then turned and placed his briefcase on the table next to Eleanor. He gave her a small, reassuring smile before addressing the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a gravelly, resonant timbre that commanded instant authority. "My name is Julian Croft. I will be taking over as counsel for Mrs. Eleanor Vance, effective immediately." A ripple of murmurs went through the small gallery. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. Even Judge Miller, a veteran of countless courtroom dramas, leaned forward, her interest piqued. But Thorne was the one who reacted audibly. He let out a small, strangled gasp, as if he'd been punched in the gut. Julian Croft. He whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a reverence bordering on fear. "I thought he was dead." He wasn't dead, but he might as well have been. Julian Croft was a legend, a phantom from a bygone era of law. In the 80s and 90s, he was the most feared corporate litigator in the state, known as the Ghost of King Street, for his uncanny ability to find the skeletons in any company's closet. He was famous for his photographic memory, his surgical cross-examinations, and his utter refusal to lose. Then 20 years ago, at the absolute peak of his career, he had vanished. He'd announced his retirement, dissolved his practice, and retreated from public life entirely to care for his ailing wife who had passed away a few years later. He had not set foot in a courtroom since. But the most devastating fact, the one that was currently causing Richard Vance's heart to hammer against his ribs, was not Julian Croft's legendary status. It was his personal connection. Julian Croft had been Richard Vance's first boss, his mentor. The man who had taken a brash, ambitious kid from the wrong side of the tracks and taught him everything about business negotiation and the law. Julian had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure. And Richard had betrayed him. 15 years ago, Richard, empowered by his growing success with Vance Sterling, had engineered a hostile takeover of a smaller historic firm. That firm was owned by Julian Croft's ailing brother-in-law. Richard had used the very tactics Julian had taught him, leveraging inside knowledge of the firm's financial weaknesses to buy it out for pennies on the dollar, bankrupting the family, and according to many, hastening the man's decline. Julian had never forgiven him. They hadn't spoken a word since. Judge Miller collected herself, peering over her spectacles at the old man. "Mr. Croft, this is highly irregular. The trial is already underway." "I am aware, Your Honor," Julian said calmly, "and I apologize to the court. However, my client has been assessing the situation, She has now determined that my particular expertise is required. I have already filed the necessary substitution of counsel with the clerk. I am prepared to proceed immediately. Proceed with what Thorne stammered, finding his voice. We've already presented our case. My client has testified. The key witness has testified. Julian Croft turned his head slowly, and for the first time fixed his pale blue eyes on Marcus Thorne. The effect was chilling. Yes, she has, he said, his voice dropping slightly. And I believe that is the perfect place for me to begin. With the court's permission, I would like to cross-examine Ms. Chloe Sterling. A jolt went through the room. Chloe, who had been watching the proceedings with detached amusement, suddenly looked unnerved. The hunter had just become the prey. Judge Miller looked from the flustered Thorne to the composed Croft, then to Eleanor, who sat with a newfound serenity. Something significant had just shifted in her courtroom. This was no longer a simple one-sided divorce. Very well, Mr. Croft. The judge said, her voice laced with intrigue. The court will allow it. Ms. Sterling, please retake the stand. Chloe walked back to the witness box, her confident stride now a little less certain. Julian Croft approached not with Thorne's aggressive posture, but with the quiet demeanor of a scholar. He had no notes. He simply stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back. Richard Vance watched his face ashen. He knew what Julian was capable of. He had seen him dismantle men far more powerful than Chloe Sterling. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was an archaeologist of lies, and he always found the bones. Julian Croft began his cross-examination not with a roar, but with a whisper. His voice was conversational, almost gentle, which seemed to unnerve Chloe more than any amount of shouting would have. Ms. Sterling, he began, you have painted a very compelling picture of a deep intellectual and creative partnership with Mr. Vance. You called yourself his muse. I did, Chloe said, lifting her chin, attempting to regain her composure. That's what I was. What I am. A muse, Julian repeated, savoring the word. A source of artistic inspiration. So let's talk about inspiration. You mentioned the Serenity Project in Big Sur. A shared dream, I believe you called it. Yes. It was born from our shared vision of seamless indoor-outdoor living. Fascinating, Julian said, his eyes twinkling. He took a step closer. Were you aware that the core design concept for that house, a glass structure cantilevered over a cliff to mimic a bird in flight, was a central feature of Mrs. Vance's graduate thesis in architectural history, submitted to Columbia University in 1998. Chloe's confident expression faltered. I don't know anything about that. You don't? Julian's voice was still soft, but it now held a razor's edge. That's strange, because Richard Vance certainly did. He was in attendance when she presented it. He called it brilliant and ahead of its time. Your Honor, he said, turning to the bench, I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit D, a certified copy of Eleanor Vance's thesis, Living on the Edge, the Aesthetics of Cantilevered Architecture. A clerk handed the document to a visibly stunned Chloe. On page 47 was a detailed sketch, a precursor to the Big Sur house, unmistakable in its form and philosophy. The shared dream was not hers and Richard's. It was Eleanor's. Richard had stolen it. Chloe stammered. It's just a coincidence, an academic concept. Let's talk about another concept. Then Julian moved on, relentless. You claimed to have spearheaded the expansion into international markets, specifically the acquisition of the waterfront development in Lisbon. Yes, that was my project, Chloe said, her voice growing defensive. I identified the opportunity and secured the local permits. You did secure the permits, that's true, Julian conceded. But the opportunity was identified 3 years prior, was it not? In an email from Eleanor Vance to her husband, following their anniversary trip to Portugal, Julian held up a single sheet of paper. Exhibit E, Your Honor. An email from Eleanor Vance to Richard Vance, dated May 14, 2019. She writes, and I quote, "Darling, that derelict warehouse district on the Tagus riverfront is a gold mine waiting to happen. The architecture is stunning. You should buy the whole district. It reminds me of the meat-packing district in New York 20 years ago." Does that sound familiar? Ms. Sterling? Chloe was pale. Richard handles thousands of emails. He gets suggestions from people all the time. But this one he forwarded directly to you, didn't he? Julian pressed. With the note, "Chloe, look into this. Eleanor might be onto something." But when you presented the final proposal, Mrs. Vance's name was nowhere to be found. Was it? You presented her idea as your own. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless accusations." "Your Honor," Julian said calmly, not even looking at Thorne, "I am simply establishing a pattern of behavior. The very pattern Ms. Sterling and Mr. Vance have accused my client of contributing nothing. It seems to me the contributions were plentiful, but the credit was acquired by others." Objection overruled. Judge Miller said, her eyes fixed on Julian. "Continue, Mr. Croft." Julian turned back to Chloe, his demeanor shifting from scholarly to surgical. "Ms. Sterling, you are paid a salary of $850,000 per year, correct?" "Yes. And last year you received a bonus of $4 million for your exemplary performance." "Yes. Was this bonus paid out from the standard corporate payroll account Yes, of course." Chloe looked nervously toward Thorne, who gave a slight, imperceptible shake of his head. She had just walked into a trap. "Are you certain, Ms. Sterling?" "Because we have subpoenaed the corporate accounts. Your bonus wasn't paid from the primary Vance Sterling payroll. It was paid along with the down payment for your Porsche and the security deposit on your penthouse apartment from a separate entity called Sterling Holdings, LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands." The color completely vanished from Chloe's face. Richard Vance gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white. Julian let the silence hang in the air before delivering the final devastating blow. An entity whose sole signatory is Richard Vance. An entity funded by siphoning off a small percentage of profits from every major Vance Sterling sale for the past 5 years. An off-the-books slush fund. It appears, Ms. Sterling, that you weren't just his muse. You were his co-conspirator in defrauding his wife and business partner of her rightful share of the marital assets. Chloe stared at him speechless. She was utterly exposed. Her carefully constructed image as a brilliant, self-made executive had been dismantled in under 10 minutes. She was just a glorified mistress paid for with stolen money. "No more questions for this witness, Your Honor," Julian Croft said, turning his back on her and walking calmly back to his table. He had taken the opposition's star witness and turned her into a liability and accomplice to fraud. Eleanor watched it all, her expression unchanged. But Mr. Davies, sitting beside her, saw her hand, which had been resting on her lap, gently place a single folded cocktail napkin on top of Julian's briefcase. It was old and faded, the ink slightly blurred. On it was a drawing of a swan, its neck gracefully curved to form the letter V. The original logo for Vance Sterling Properties. She hadn't just been observing, she had been preparing. She had been building her arsenal, and her quiet, brilliant general was just getting started. If the cross-examination of Chloe Sterling was a surgical strike, what Julian Croft did to Vance Sterling Properties was a controlled demolition. He had spent the last 2 decades in quiet retirement, but his mind had lost none of its sharpness. More importantly, he had the one thing Marcus Thorne's entire team lacked: the truth, meticulously documented by an observant and underestimated wife. Eleanor had spent the months leading up to the divorce, not weeping, but working. Her curator's eye, trained to spot forgeries and trace provenance, was now turned on her own life. She combed through 20 years of household records, forgotten photo albums, old day planners, and dusty boxes in the attic. She wasn't just looking for evidence of infidelity. She was excavating her own history, a history Richard had tried to bury. Julian now laid that history bare for the court to see. His first move was to dismantle the myth of the self-made man. He called to the stand a mousy, balding man in his late 60s named Albert Finch. He was the retired bank manager who had handled Eleanor's inheritance after her grandmother passed. Mr. Finch Julian asked, his tone respectful. "Do you recall a transaction in 1999 involving Mrs. Vance?" "Why, do, sir." Very clearly, Mr. Finch said, peering through his bifocals. "Eleanor, Mrs. Vance came to me. She wanted to wire $50,000 from her inheritance account, not to her husband, mind you. She was very specific. It was to go directly to a holding company to purchase their first investment property. So it was not a gift to her husband, as Mr. Vance testified. Oh no, it was an investment. She had me draw up the paperwork as such. A seed capital investment in exchange for a 50% founding partnership stake in their new venture." Julian turned to face Richard, a venture which a month later was incorporated as Vance Properties. The Sterling was added years later. Your Honor, Exhibit G, the original wire transfer and investment agreement, signed by Albert Finch, a document Mrs. Vance kept in her grandmother's recipe box for 22 years. Thorne was on his feet, objecting furiously, but the damage was done. The very foundation of Richard's story, that he had started with nothing but his own grit, had crumbled. He was not a solo act. He was a partnership. Next, Julian called a surprise witness, David Chen, the celebrated architect behind 3 of Vance Sterling's most iconic and profitable buildings. Richard smiled, assuming David was there to testify for him. They played golf together. Mr. Chen Julian began. "You are familiar with Eleanor. Vance, are you not?" "Of course," David said, smiling warmly at Eleanor. "Eleanor is brilliant. Her understanding of spacelight and aesthetic flow is more intuitive than most trained architects I know." Richard's smile vanished. Julian continued. "Could you tell the court about the design process for the Azure Tower?" "Certainly." Richard brought me the initial contract, but I was struggling with the client's demands for the lobby. They wanted something grand, but not ostentatious. I was stuck. Richard invited me over for dinner to discuss it. During the meal, Eleanor and I started talking about her recent trip to the Guggenheim in Bilbao. She began sketching on a napkin, explaining how Gehry used curved metal to create a sense of movement and light. That sketch. David paused, looking directly at the jury. That sketch became the basis for the Azure Tower's award-winning lobby. I still have it, And did Mrs. Vance receive any official credit for this multi-million-dollar design contribution? Julian asked quietly. No, David said, shaking his head. Richard told me to keep it between us. He said it was better to keep business and home life separate. Julian Croft proceeded like this for an entire day. He produced evidence of Eleanor's direct and substantial contributions. There was the cocktail napkin with the original logo sketch, authenticated by a handwriting expert. There were emails from Richard years old, praising her genius eye for scouting undervalued neighborhoods that later became development gold mines. There was testimony from a high-powered city councilwoman who recalled Eleanor's passionate, well-researched argument at a neighborhood board meeting that had secured the crucial zoning variance for the Beaumont Hotel. With each piece of evidence, each witness, Julian was not just proving Eleanor's involvement, he was systematically deconstructing the persona Richard had so carefully built. Richard Vance wasn't a lone visionary. He was the front man for a two-person band who had later decided to kick his co-writer out and claim he wrote all the songs himself. The final blow came when Julian recalled Richard Vance to the stand. Richard, now visibly shaken and hostile, took his seat. Julian didn't ask about Chloe or the hidden accounts. He asked about his old mentor. Richard, Julian said, his voice laced with a cold, quiet disappointment. 15 years ago, you used the principles I taught you to dismantle my brother-in-law's company. Do you remember what I told you was the single most important principle of good business? Richard stared back, his jaw tight. Maximizing shareholder value. No. Julian said, his voice cutting through the silent courtroom. I told you the most important principle was that your name, your word, is your only true asset. That integrity is the foundation upon which any lasting empire is built. You seem to have forgotten that. You erased your wife's name from your company's history. You erased my brother-in-law's legacy. You erase anyone who is no longer convenient to you. Julian walked back to his table and picked up a thick binder. Your Honor. This is the sum of our evidence. It proves beyond any doubt that Vance Sterling Properties is not the sole creation of Richard Vance. It is and always has been a marital asset built from a 50-50 partnership. Mrs. Vance is not seeking alimony. She is not seeking a settlement. She is seeking what is rightfully hers. 50% of the company, she co-founded her name, restored to the corporate charter, and her history, which her husband tried so hard to erase, brought back into the light. He placed the binder on the clerk's desk with a heavy final thud. It was the sound of an empire being broken in two. The 2 days of recess while Judge Miller deliberated were a unique form of torment for everyone involved. For Richard Vance and Marcus Thorne, it was a purgatory of frantic calculations and whispered reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. For Eleanor, it was a strange and suspended calm, the deep, quiet breath before a diver breaks the surface. She spent the time in the sterile quiet of a hotel room, not her home. The house on the hill was still a crime scene of the heart, and she wouldn't return until she knew to whom it truly belonged. She read a novel, drank tea, and for the first time in months, slept through the night. The battle was over. All that remained was the verdict of the war. When they reassembled in courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Richard had attempted to reconstruct his mask of impervious confidence, but the cracks were visible. A faint tremor in his hand, a dullness in the eyes that once held a conqueror's glint. Marcus Thorne looked haggard. The bulldog now a worried hound, his bespoke suit seeming to hang on a deflated frame. Eleanor walked in with Julian Croft at her side. She wore a simple navy blue dress the color of a deep, calm ocean. She no longer looked like a ghost in beige. She looked solid, present. She met the curious gazes of the gallery, not with timidity, but with a serene, level stare. She was no longer a subject of their pity. She was the protagonist of a story they were all desperate to see conclude. Judge Miller entered her face an unreadable granite slab. The rustle of everyone rising and sitting was the only sound. She settled her glasses on her nose, opened a thick file, and the room held its breath. I have reviewed the testimony and the extensive evidence presented in the case of Vance v. Vance. She began, her voice devoid of emotion. While divorce proceedings are often fraught with personal grievance, this court was tasked with a specific and fundamental question: the nature and valuation of the marital assets, specifically as they pertain to the entity known as Vance Sterling Properties. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the petitioners' and respondents' tables. The respondent, Mr. Richard Vance, she continued, has presented a narrative of a sole creator, a self-made man, whose genius and tireless work built an empire while his wife, the petitioner, enjoyed the benefits as a non-contributing party. The respondents' counsel has argued that Mrs. Vance was a traditional housewife entitled to a generous but ultimately finite spousal support package. Judge Miller paused, taking a sip of water. The silence stretched thin and taut. This narrative, she declared, her voice suddenly infused with a steely authority, is a work of self-serving fiction, demonstrably false in almost every material aspect. A collective gasp, however faint, rippled through the courtroom. Richard Vance flinched, as if struck. The court finds the evidence presented by the petitioner's counsel, Mr. Croft, to be not just compelling, but overwhelming. A partnership in a marriage of this length is not defined solely by names on a corporate charter or a position on a payroll. It is a complex ecosystem of mutual support, shared risk, and collaborative creation. The evidence shows, without a shadow of a doubt, that Eleanor Vance was not a passive beneficiary, but an active and essential co-founder of the enterprise at the heart of this dispute. She began to list the points, each one a hammer blow to Richard's crumbling facade. The court recognizes Exhibit G, the authenticated investment agreement, proving Mrs. Vance's initial $50,000 was not a gift, but foundational seed capital. The court recognizes the testimony of Mr. David Chen, which established Mrs. Vance's direct, uncredited, and business-altering creative contributions. The court recognizes the pattern established through emails and witness testimony of Mrs. Vance identifying key real estate opportunities which her husband and his associates later claimed as their own discoveries. She fixed her gaze on Richard. Furthermore, the court finds Mr. Vance's establishment of the Sterling Holdings LLC entity to be a deliberate and fraudulent attempt to conceal marital assets and defraud the petitioner of her rightful share. It speaks to a profound breach of the fiduciary duty one spouse owes another. The judge then turned a page, her tone becoming colder still. Mr. Vance did not just try to deny his wife a fair financial settlement. The evidence suggests a systematic, years-long campaign to erase her from their shared history, to take her ideas, her insights, and her foundational support and repackage them as his own solitary genius. That is an act of profound personal and professional betrayal that this court will not reward. Eleanor closed her eyes. It was one thing to know the truth yourself. It was another entirely to hear it validated, to have your stolen history given back to you with the full authority of the law. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of vindication, a quiet baptism into her new life. Therefore, Judge Miller concluded, her voice ringing with finality. It is the judgment of this court that the entity Vance Sterling Properties is a marital asset in its entirety. The court orders the immediate dissolution of the current corporate structure. The assets are to be divided exactly in half, 50% to the petitioner Eleanor Vance, 50% to the respondent Richard Vance. This includes all property's liquid assets and all funds held in offshore accounts. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, to right the historical record, the court orders that any future entity arising from these assets must legally and permanently recognize Eleanor Vance as a co-founder. Her name will be restored. The court will not allow her erasure to stand. It was over. Richard sat utterly still, the color of ash. He stared at his hands on the table. The hands that had built and signed and bullied his way to the top, as if he no longer recognized them. Beside him, Marcus Thorne quietly packed his briefcase, the picture of a man who had brought a cannon to a gunfight, only to find his opponent had a nuclear weapon. As the judge adjourned and the room erupted in muted chaos, Eleanor remained seated, taking a slow, deep breath. Julian Croft placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's done, Eleanor," he said softly. She nodded, wiping the single tear from her cheek with the back of her finger. She felt light. The crushing weight of 20 years of being minimized, of being made to feel small, had been lifted. She stood up and turned to leave. As she reached the aisle, a voice, raw and desperate, cut through the din. "Ellie." It was Richard. He had stumbled over to her, his face a ruin of disbelief and panic. His eyes, for the first time in years, held no artifice. They were just the eyes of a terrified man who had lost everything. "Ellie, we can't. This isn't right," he stammered, reaching for her arm. Eleanor took a step back, avoiding his touch. She looked at him, truly, looked at him, and saw a stranger. The charismatic titan was gone, replaced by a hollow man. "It's not the money, is it, Richard?" she asked, her voice calm and even, carrying only in the small space between them. "You could lose half your money and build it back again." "That's not what you're afraid of." He stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "You lost the story," she explained, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "Your story. The myth of the great Richard Vance, the solo genius who did it all himself. That's what Julian took from you today. He didn't take your money. He took your lie. And it was the only thing you had left. We can appeal. We can fix this," he pleaded. Eleanor gave a small, sad shake of her head. "No, Richard. You can't. You didn't just lie to the court. You lied to me. You lied to yourself for so long you forgot what the truth was. You didn't just try to steal our company. You tried to steal our history. And you can't have it back." With that, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She walked down the aisle past the stunned faces and whispering reporters, with Julian Croft at her side. As she pushed open the heavy courtroom doors and stepped into the light of the hallway, she felt the last 20 years fall away from her like a heavy coat. The week that followed was a blur of reclamation. She returned to the house on the hill, not as a guest in Richard's world, but as its rightful owner. The first thing she did was walk into his cavernous, mahogany-paneled office. On the wall behind his desk was an enormous, flattering oil portrait of him, commissioned 5 years ago, depicting him staring heroically into the middle distance. Without a moment's hesitation, she lifted it off the wall, carried it into the garage, and leaned it against a stack of old tires, facing the wall. She went back inside the space on the wall, now a blank, promising void. She spent days with accountants and lawyers, the new team she was assembling. She was decisive, intelligent, and focused. The men and women in suits, initially expecting a bewildered housewife, quickly learned they were dealing with a formidable mind. She was not just claiming her assets, she was taking command of them. Finally, at the end of the week, she met Julian for coffee. It was a crisp, clear autumn day, and they sat at an outdoor table of a small, sunlit cafe. The noise of the city felt distant, a world away from the suffocating silence of the courtroom. "I cannot thank you enough, Julian," Eleanor said, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. "You didn't just win my case. You gave me my voice back." Julian smiled, his old eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your voice was always there, Eleanor. It was just quiet. Sometimes a quiet voice speaks the most profound truths. I simply provided the amplification." He looked at her, a genuine pride in his expression. "I confess I took this case for reasons of old business, for my brother-in-law. But I finished it for you, seeing you in that courtroom, seeing the strength you held in your stillness. It was a privilege. Still," she said, "I owe you more than I can say." "Then pay me back by doing something brilliant with what you've won," he challenged gently. He nodded toward a leather-bound notebook on the table beside her. "What's next for the co-founder of one of the city's largest real estate empires?" Eleanor opened the book. It was filled with sketches, notes, and ideas. On the first page was a beautiful, elegant design for a new company logo. 2 letters, E and V, were intertwined to create the image of a house with an open door conveying both structure and welcome. Below it, in clean, crisp lettering, were the words, "Vance, Curation and Design." "My hobbies," she said the word, now stripped of all its condescending poison, reclaimed as a badge of honor. "I'm going to pursue them full-time, but not as hobbies, as a business." She began to speak, and the voice Julian had unlocked was now filled with passion and vision. "For 20 years I curated our homes, our life, the art on our walls. I helped clients and investors feel a connection to a space. That's what's missing from so much of modern development of soul. Richard built expensive boxes. I want to build homes. I'll consult with architects from the ground up, design interiors, curate art collections for private and corporate clients. I'll use the capital I've won to invest in ethical, beautiful, human-centric design." She tapped the logo. "Vance Curation. I'm keeping the name. My name. The one I earned." As she was speaking, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a small, surprised smile forming on her lips. "Who is it?" Julian asked. "It's David Chen," she said, her eyes bright with a new kind of energy. "The architect." His text says, "Heard the news. So happy for you. I have a new client who wants to build something with a soul. Are you available for a consultation?" Eleanor looked up from her phone, her smile widening. She looked past Julian, at the bustling street, at the city skyline she knew so intimately, at the future that was no longer a vague hope, but a tangible, ringing reality. "Yes, Julian," she said, answering his earlier question as she typed her reply to David. "I think I will do something brilliant." That was the story of Eleanor Vance, a powerful reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet observer, the patient planner, the one who gathers the truth while others are busy broadcasting their lies. Eleanor's journey shows us that your history is worth fighting for, and your contributions, no matter how much someone tries to erase them, are real. She didn't just win a court case. She reclaimed her identity and proved that the most formidable power comes from knowing your own worth, even when the world tries to tell you you're worthless. If her story of quiet resilience and ultimate triumph resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more real-life stories of justice, empowerment, and incredible personal victories. Thank you for listening.